so excited to be joined by my guest this week. He is the New York Times bestselling author of Grace, President Obama in 10 Days in the Battle for America. He is also President Obama's former speechwriter and the only former Obama staffer who doesn't have his own podcast yet. Please welcome back to the Nerds of Color, Cody Keenan.
What's up, Keith? Good to see you again, man.
I'm glad you're on this podcast, even if you don't have your own just yet. Is that in the cards?
It sounds like a lot of work. So, no.
And it's funny because like everyone, including the former president, like he had a podcast. Like he and Bruce Springsteen did a podcast. What is the appeal of podcasts? I'm asking while I'm also doing a podcast.
I don't know. There's so many of them that I just always feel overwhelmed by what to listen to. And since COVID, I don't have a commute anymore because we're still working from home just because we have a daughter. We've been too lazy to find anywhere else to go. So my listening list is pretty short. My publishing house tried to get me to do one just to sell this book, and I told them no. You'll
be happy to guest on podcasts, but you don't want to host your own.
Yeah, that's much easier. Just showing up is a lot easier.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this one we get to talk about DC, not just the nation's capital, but our favorite home of our favorite superheroes. But I did want to talk a little bit about the book because one, it is a great book, Cody. Congratulations. Who knew you were such a great writer?
To put something under your own name though is scary. It's the first time I've had to do it. I always had everything I ever wrote was filtered through Obama, which is great. But to put your own name on it is a little frightening.
Yeah. Well, and the thing about the book, like when it came out in October, right? Like early October. So the environment now, like reading the book versus reading the book back in October is a little bit different, I think, because like what I love about the book is that it made me nostalgic for like the Obama presidency, but it also was like filled with so much hope. And at the time, we're barreling down towards this midterm election where everything felt like it was coming off the rails. Reading the book now and like talking to you about the book now, post midterm elections, post the Congress passing the Respect for Marriage Act, it kind of like brings you back to that period in those 10 days when you wrote what you wrote about in Grace. Just like there's actually hope again in America, I guess is what I'm saying, despite all the like dark clouds that are still swirling up there.
If you're giving my book credit for the midterms, I'll take it.
Yeah, that's like basically that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, the book is very honest about the fact that those 10 days in a way, in several ways, kind of felt like a triumph, despite the fact that they were rooted in unimaginable horror and grief, but they were followed by these 4 years that were basically the opposite. And that's what actually gave me the idea for the book was kind of living through the upside down. But it's also clear about the fact that progress is not something you can ever take for granted. It's always not just fragile, but it's something you constantly have to protect and secure and then fight for to get the rest. And one of the few bright lights of the Trump years was that so many people actually realized that and got involved and engaged in democracy. And I think the coolest thing that we're only just starting to see is all these people running for office who quote unquote aren't supposed to be running for office. That's something Michelle Obama said at the portrait unveiling at the White House a few months ago, the phrase supposed to. She said, I was never supposed to be here. And who decides what that means? And so, with each successive election since 2016, you've got more people running for office who are actually more representative of America and have, diverse and different perspectives that match, what the country really looks like. We've got the first Gen Z Congress member now. And there was a great story about him in the paper the other day. Someone who's actually grown up, known what it's like to work in the gig economy, going through active shooter drills in school, like the things that my students go through. There's finally a member of Congress that has lived their lives. And I think that's only going to keep getting more prolific and more profound in the years to come.
And I think just even the fact that this is like 2 midterms in a row where the turnout was like presidential level. Like imagine had Obama had that kind of turnout in the midterms when you guys were in office, like, because that's always the thing is like, turnout is always really low in the midterms, but then, you know, the opposing party always feels like they have a mandate when it's like literally a third of the people came out to vote for you. You know what I mean? Like there is no mandate, but like the Tea Party Republicans back in 2010 was like, this is what the country wants. And, you know, the political press kind of treats them as if like that was a mandate. But like we're seeing like in 2018 and now in 2022, like there really is this kind of acceptance that like we can't just vote every 4 years. We have to vote every year and we have to organize every year.
Yeah, and there's very real consequences for it too. I mean, what happened earlier this year with the Dobbs decision on the Supreme Court that overturned Roe that was rooted in 2014 when there was really low turnout. Republicans took back the Senate, and Mitch McConnell blocked President Obama from putting Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court.
Right.
And that set the stage then for Trump to rush through 3 justices, and that set the stage for overturning Roe. And you know, all these things take a long time to bear fruit. I mean, the Dobbs decision is also the result of 50 years of conservatives trying to do this. But you know, even those off-year elections, midterm elections, really matter.
Yeah, you chose June 17th, 2015, to start the narrative of grace. And one thing, and of course, that's the day that Dylann Roof murdered parishioners at the Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina. But what I didn't realize until I got to the prologue is that the day before, had you done 11 days in the battle for America, the day before was Trump's escalator thing. Like, that's wild too to think about, like, just what happened in that 2-week period. And it kind of did set the stage, as I said earlier, for what, like, America we're still experiencing here in 2022. Like, did you know in the moment, like, what made you decide that, like, I want to talk about these specific 10, 11 days in 2015?
It's a couple things. One is, you know, the sheer magnitude of events that happened over those 10 days. I remember somebody writing at the end of that period, it was a series of events too implausible for an entire season of The West Wing. You know, you had this white supremacist murder 9 Black parishioners in their church and say he wanted to start a race war. You had the families of the victims forgive him in open court at his arraignment. You had Republican governors, you know, I really think based off what those families did and the reaction and everything, kind of quietly bring down the Confederate flag over a couple of southern state houses. And as you mentioned, we were preparing for the Supreme Court rulings on marriage equality and on Obamacare. And there was a chance that the Supreme Court would, you know, kick millions of people who were working 2 jobs, but making too much money to qualify for Medicaid, kick them off their insurance. And then for, you know, what rarely covered was the fact that 140 million people who got their insurance through their employer were going to lose all their protections, like pre-existing conditions protections. There was a very real chance that the Supreme Court was going to tell millions of Americans, you can't get married to who you love, effectively, you know, declaring them second-class citizens. And through it all, we're deciding whether or not Obama's actually going to speak in Charleston because he didn't want to. And I didn't want to write another eulogy. We'd already done a dozen of these. But ultimately he does. You know, we win both those Supreme Court cases. And then on the 10th day, when marriage equality hits, he also flies down to Charleston. And gives this eulogy where he sings Amazing Grace and comes back and the White House is lit up in all the colors of the rainbow. I mean, it was just wild and dramatic and exhausting. But all of those events also speak to something big, which is, you know, who we are as Americans, whether or not we actually believe that all of us are created equal, whether we're going to stand up to racism and bigotry, inequality, and you know, practice what we preach. And in that week, it felt over and over like the resounding answer was yes. And then, of course, you know, we lived through 4 years after that. So it's just this constant struggle. You know, I borrowed Obama's thesis in his summer speech for the book, which is that politics is not a clash of armies, it's a clash of wills.
Right.
It's a contest to determine the true meaning of America. You know, every single election, every single day, what we do, we have to decide what kind of country we want this to be.
And then, you know, he even talks about like taking every step you take 2 steps back. And, you know, a lot of the fights that we were having in 2015, we're still having, as I said, the Congress. You know, the reason Congress had to pass the Respect for Marriage Act is that the Supreme Court, after Dobbs, was kind of signaling like, hey, you know, gay marriage and interracial marriage might not be, you know, like protected anymore, which is wild to think about. Yeah. But that kind of spurs us on to have to do something about that. The other thing that comes out reading the book is, you often described like kind of like imposter syndrome, right? Writing for, of all people, President Obama. I think you even said like it's the fucking terrifying to write for him. And like I just want to ask you, like, you had been with the president since the campaign, right? Like you were there from Jump Street before he became like the president, like the Barack Obama. Like there was, of course, the 2004 speech, but you knew him before everyone else really kind of like saw him as this political superstar. But when someone as good a writer as President Obama, because like, no shade to like past presidents, I feel like Obama's probably the best. Like if he wasn't president, he would be like, I mean, he was a best-selling author. Like what goes through your mind when you're sitting down, like having to write a speech for him? Because unlike, Trump, who just like, who doesn't look at a speech until it's in the teleprompter, right? Like you're collaborating in line edits and red markers and everything like that for like hours and hours and days. Like just walk us through that kind of feeling of writing for one of the best writers to ever grace the Oval Office.
Yeah, it is fucking terrifying. And it's specifically because he is such a good writer. I mean, he reminds me to this day that he wrote that 2004 speech by himself, that he wrote his books by himself. And he's on record saying, I'm a better speechwriter than my speechwriters. I'll get to the terrifying part. He always viewed speechwriting as a collaboration between him and his speechwriters, and there was a team of 8 of us that wrote for him. And I loved every single one of them. He just wanted us to give him something he could work with, because he would stay up late every night. His favorite time to write was between midnight and 2 a.m. and that's when he'd do all of his edits that you've probably seen in Pete Souza's photos. But that was never enough for us. We wanted to impress him. We wanted to get him, that perfect draft. We wanted to get him something great. Because he was good to us. He was a good boss, and that's something you want to reward. So the terrifying part was trying to get him that perfect draft, even though he never asked for it. And I'm pretty honest about it throughout this book, but especially with the eulogy after Charleston, I felt like I knew I hadn't quite gotten it where it needed to be, and told him as much. And he called me back into the White House around 11 p.m. the night before the eulogy. This is day 9 of the book. And he had just crossed out the last 2 pages in their entirety, which he'd never done to me before, and rewrote them longhand. And so I apologized to him. I think it was the first and only time I apologized to him for not meeting the moment. And he said, "Look, brother, we're collaborators. You gave me what I needed to work with here. And when you look through what I wrote, you're going to see a lot of your work in there. But more importantly, when you've been thinking about these issues for 40 years, you'll know what you want to say too." And that's what made him a good boss. That's why we wanted to get him something great. He could have just said, "If you can't do this, I'll find someone who can," or even worse, he could have just handed the edits to somebody else and excised me from the process entirely. But he took the time at midnight to sit me down and walk me through what he did.
Right.
And so what's important about that is you leave there feeling fired up instead of let down. He was just good that way.
And you mentioned that the having 40 years to think about these kinds of issues, like that's another theme in the book about how Obama's speechwriters have always been white males, and you kind of struggle with that, being like, how can you talk about these things, like what happened in South Carolina, or even the Selma speech, which you actually start the book off in the prologue about preparing for this. I love the shade you throw at how DC handles snow coming from Chicago. You and the president, just like, for those who don't know, Washington does not handle snow very well. Anyway, sorry for the weather report tangent, but like Chicago can handle its snow is what I'm saying. The question I'm trying to ask is, how do you resolve that? The idea that like the first Black president, that you're writing for the first Black president, writing about race in America in the wake of white supremacists attacked on a Southern church, in the wake of the anniversary of the Selma bridge crossing. Like, walk us through like your mindset and what you kind of like resolve, or don't necessarily resolve, but wrestle with in the book. Yeah,
and you can add Trayvon Martin, Ferguson, all sorts of things to that list. It was always a challenge, not because I harbored views that were different than his, but you still want to do it justice. And to be a speechwriter means you can write for anybody. You have to
Yeah.
inhabit somebody's mind and understand not just what they want to say, but why they want to say it. And so empathy is really important to that. You want to be able to understand every audience, walk around in their shoes. And there are limits to that. You can talk to all sorts of people. You can read every book in existence, but I've never lived the Black experience in America. It's really different. You can imagine what it is, you can read about it, but it's just not the same. And so, fortunately, he really was our chief speechwriter. And so any speech process would begin with a lot of listening. I'd ask him questions to get some good prompts out of him, and then try to do it justice. I mean, that's my nervousness was in giving him the draft, because anything I wrote didn't just go out into the world, a fait accompli. He would dive in and edit and get it to the right place. But you didn't want to write anything for him that would kind of expose you as a fraud, or somebody has no idea what they're talking about. But I asked him once pretty early in my tenure as chief speechwriter, I said, do you wish you had a Black chief speechwriter? And he said two things. He said, number one, the system doesn't allow for it, which is a little fatalistic coming from him. But what he meant was, politics is still very much a white man's profession, just like everything else. It's changing a little too slowly. But one of the perks of being who I was is when I first moved to Washington, and the only job I could find was an unpaid internship in the Senate. I had parents who could help me with my rent until I made that first $18,000 a year job. That excludes a lot of good people from the political process. It's changing now. A lot of internships on Capitol Hill are paid, and they're actually paid more than my entire first year salary, which is great. But it's a real battle to slowly change this. By the end of and it's just not something there's time for in the White House, as rough as that sounds. When you're trying to rescue the global economy and fight all these battles at the same time, put out all these fires, you don't get free time to try to reform the system. That's something my firm is working on now. We, by the second term, we had gotten the speechwriting shop to the point where we had one writer of color and we were half women. And, that's great because you get more diverse perspectives and life experiences on the team. There's still a long way to go. I have a speechwriting firm now called Fenway, and we are half writers of color and half women. And we're still always trying to do better. There's a great group out there called Speechwriters of Color that's working to change things, but it just, like any other arena, it takes a lot of time. But it's really, really important.
Did you ever sit through any of Trump's speeches, and aside from the terrible content of what Trump was saying in those speeches, but think about how the fuck did Stephen Miller get, he succeeded you as chief speechwriter in the White House, and to your point about this taking the profession seriously, and then this clown is delivering speeches for the president that are again, aside from the terrible content, terribly written. Did you ever just tear your hair out? Or I'm sure there were other things that are more dire during the Trump presidency than oh my God, Stephen Miller is such a shitty writer. But
as pieces of rhetoric, they weren't good. It was just word salad. White nationalist ambrosia. I don't know who put my Wikipedia page together. It's always weird when somebody does one for you, but the worst thing on it is the fact that his name is on there just as my successor. I've always wished I could scrub that.
Obama to Trump, and then Cody Keenan to Stephen Miller. It's it is that whole 2 steps forward, 3 steps back Paula Abdul lyric. Anyway, one last thing I wanted to talk about. You are wearing a Bears hat. You are famously a Chicago Cubs fan. And one thing you say in the book, I believe, is that you were going to stay in the White House until the Cubs are invited because they won the World Series. And you said this in 2008. Saying it in 2008 was a wild statement. But 4 days before you guys left the White House, in walks the Chicago Cubs. One, I wanted to ask you, Obama is also a South Sider.
Yeah.
What was it like for him to welcome the Cubs to the White House? Before I ask, what was it like for you? What was it like for him, a dyed-in-the-wool Sox fan, to have the Cubbies walk into the White House?
He was very generous about it because he knew what it meant for the city. That make a serious point first before I get to the good story. I forgot to answer the second part of your question earlier about being a white speechwriter for him. We both call Chicago our hometown. I was born and raised in Wrigleyville. But we lived worlds apart. Even though we were on the same L line, we were both on the red line. It's a totally different city on the north side and the south side. And But that's the other thing about when I asked him if he wanted a black speechwriter, he said, "Look, I've put a lot of time and effort into you. I've invested a lot into you, and you understand me, and you understand what I believe and what I want to say." And I really have adopted his worldview as mostly my own. Um, but so he, and that just comes by virtue of the things we do share, like being proud Chicagoans. And he knew what it meant for the city. What was really cool is, well, I'll back up a little bit. That was always my answer to deflect the question: when are you going to leave the White House? I'll leave when the Cubs win the World Series.
It's kind of like pigs fly kind of thing.
Yeah, and then they did in the last year, the final year. But that presented us with a problem. So they won the World Series 1 week before the election, and typically the World Series champs come the following summer when they're in town to play the Nats. Mm-hmm. We were not going to let that happen. We were not going to let President Trump or President Hillary Clinton, whoever won the election, because we didn't know at the time, welcome the Cubs to the White House. And I'd always harbored a little bit of sports animosity for Hillary Clinton because she'd always called herself a Cubs fan. Then when she ran for Senate in New York, she'd be wearing a Yankees hat. I was like, get out of here with that. You don't get to welcome the Cubs in. And I'm sure Trump doesn't know much about baseball, so he doesn't get to welcome them either. It was an uphill battle for us to get the Cubs because, they all go their separate ways on vacation in the off season. So that's one hurdle. Another is that the owner of the Cubs and his entire family are basically MAGA Republicans. One of the Ricketts siblings is not. She was an Obama supporter. So that's a challenge. But we had some help. Theo Epstein, who was manager of the Cubs at the time, was an Obama supporter. So he pushed hard, and we got a bunch of people who worked for the team to push hard on it. And we finally got a date where they could almost all come. 2 players decided not to come. And so it was the final week of the White House. President Obama was leaving office on Friday. Cubs all came on Monday. About 2/3 of our staff had already checked out because there was just staggered departures. You can't have everybody leave on Inauguration Day. So and most of my team was gone, but I was going to write these anyway. I've been waiting for these literally my entire life. So usually when a sports team comes to the White House, we limit the president's remarks to about 5 minutes because, he's got other things to do. That morning, I hand him a 20-minute speech. And he goes, come on, man. And it's like, just read it. And it was like a love letter to the city of Chicago, to fandom, to Cubs, to families. I've been inspired by all these stories of there were people going to their father's graves with the radio to listen to the World Series. I mean, that's what it means. And it was also the first sporting event at the White House where the First Lady came, and she came downstairs, and we all gathered in the state dining room first. And she talked to all the players about how she used to sit on her dad's lap and watch the Cubs on WGN when she was a little girl, and looking over, and like Javi Baez is crying, and you've got all these big athletes kind of tearing up. It was wonderful. And she and the president took individual photos with every player, which had never happened before. And then we go in and have this kind of raucous party. We went into the Oval Office with Anthony Rizzo and David Ross, and it was the final week. What else are we going to do? We're kind of bolting everything down that we can, but for an hour, I'm going to have fun with all my heroes.
Yeah. And I mean, again, you called it just like your book saved the midterms back in 2008. You called the Cubbies winning the World Series in 2016. So
called my shot, just like Tom Berenger in Major League.
And you were there for when the '85 Bears came to the White House too, right?
Yeah, that's right, because that was 2011.
What was that like?
Much different. They never got to come in '85
because of the Challenger.
Yeah, the Challenger exploded. So somebody, I don't know the whole story here. Somebody at the NFL figured out, they were like, oh my God, the Bears never got to come. There's a Bears fan in the White House. Let's do this. Most of the team came, a lot of them were old, Walter Payton had tragically passed away. Some of the guys you could tell weren't doing all that hot, suffering from, I don't know, CT or whatever. And a couple of them just got blitzed drunk. It was wild. But so I wrote those remarks too, and I also bought a White House football from the gift shop, one of those ones that's like a white panel for autographs, and I walked around like a kid in a candy store just asking everybody to sign my football. I wish I had it right now. It's in the other room, but that was a pretty great day.
Yeah, I mean that was one of my favorite things about the Obama presidency. Like, to your point, you had a Chicago sports fan in the White House, and to have the Bears to correct that wrong, to have that Super Bowl team finally come to the White House was awesome.
We're just fixing injustices all over the place, man.
Exactly. Speaking of injustice, there's a famous Alex Ross painting that he did back in, I believe, during the 2008 campaign, where it's Obama ripping the shirt and he looks like Superman. I'm wondering, for you as a lifelong Superman fan, Do you see the resemblance? Like they both stand for hope. You know what I mean? Like Obama is he embodies everything that you love about Superman. Is that part of what drew you to his campaign and ultimately to his right hand side?
Truth, justice, and the American way. Yeah, and he talked about when I was at the '04 speech. I worked for Ted
Right, because you
Kennedy at
worked
the
for
time.
Kennedy.
Yeah, and so we were all out there volunteering for the week, and our reward for volunteering, we had to take a week off work to avoid federal election laws and campaigning laws. But so our
Back when
reward was
people had to follow campaign and election
yeah,
laws.
pesky things like ethics. Our reward was a floor pass for one night of the convention, and mine happened to be the night that Obama was speaking. I'll be honest, I didn't really know much about him because I had spent the previous 2 years boning up on Massachusetts politics just for my job. And in comes this guy who's, he basically walks into the Fleet Center anonymous and walks out a global megastar 17 minutes later. I mean, that's what a good speech can do. But he talked about politics the way I wanted it to be. Um, he was idealistic and hopeful, and that doesn't mean he wasn't realistic either. I've never seen a conflict between realism and idealism. Realism is approaching the world as it is, and then idealism is fighting for the world as you want it to be. And we joke now about how, I mean, that speech was amazing. The worst parts of it were the parts that sounded like any other typical political speech. And those were the parts about John Kerry and John Edwards because they had to be in there, because he was their keynote speaker. But the rest of it it read and sounded like something that had not been polished over and sandpapered by an army of political advisors and pollsters, and it was refreshing and new, and it was something that here's the parallel between Obama and Superman: they made you want to be better. They made you want to be the best version of yourself.
One thing that a lot of people, particularly like in the post-Obama years, and you have a lot of like cynicism kind of return in the political world, and like the parallel too is with comics and with Superman. You have a lot of folks who like say Superman's boring or he's too vanilla, or it's we don't live in a time where you can have a big blue Boy Scout anymore. He needs to be dark and gritty, and you saw that in like the movies and things like that. And people will say like Obama's too naive or too like the politics is just too cynical for someone like Obama. As a fan of Superman and seeing how a lot of writers have kind of like tried to turn him into this more of a a badass or like this all-powerful god rather than like the down-home salt of the earth from Kansas. Like if you were James Gunn, right, if you had the job to run DC Studios, what would you do with Superman the character?
Yeah, cynicism is easy. Cynicism is fashionable, right? Because you're almost never wrong. If you just think that, oh, that person's going to let us down, politics is going to let me down, then it's you kind of feel good about yourself when you're rarely wrong. But sometimes you are wrong, and profoundly so. And the people who actually not only believed but did the effort, did the work to try to change something, that's a much more fulfilling way of being right. Another interesting parallel, I think, is I'm obsessed with Tom Taylor's run on Son of Superman, on John Kent. There's this gorgeous panel or page in one of the first issues, second, third, maybe, I'm not sure, where Superman and his son are sitting on the moon looking at Earth, having a deep conversation. And like John actually asks his dad, and here's a direct parallel to the Obama years too, why aren't you doing more? It's written from the perspective of kind of a Gen Zer, like all my students. And he says, I can see the climate changing, with microscopic vision or whatever. I can see pain and poverty and inequality and people hurting each other. And it's like, Dad, why aren't you doing anything about this? And there's like a direct parallel to, I remember Obama was always bummed out when, his own daughters, Malia, would ask, why haven't you plugged the hole in the Gulf of Mexico yet when it was leaking oil?
Right.
I mean, that really happened. And so I understand the temptation to look at politics as if nobody's doing anything, because so little ever changes. I mean, the marriage bill is a huge step forward. A bunch of things in the book were a huge step forward. Victories are few and far between in politics. I mean, we spent 2,922 days in the White House, and we'd go home happy if we move the ball forward a couple inches each day. And that is not pessimistic. That is not giving up. It's because all those inches ultimately add up to first downs, and then you get a touchdown. And
Right,
it just
right.
takes a long time. You, especially in a democracy, you don't get to do everything you want all the time you want. So for Superman's own son to criticize him and say you're not doing enough, I think that's how a lot of Gen Zers feel. It's how a lot of my students feel. You know, they've inherited this kind of world that feels broken and system that feels broken, and you know, we grown-ups haven't done enough to change it.
Yeah.
But that's when I think, to get back to the actual question, that's when I think hope and optimism and idealism are so important. It sets an example. I mean, why would you want to set, well, actually, I know the answer to this. If you want to set an example of cynicism, that's because you don't want the system to change. You want people to believe like they have no agency. You
Mhm.
know, actually organizing and inspiring and giving people that agency is what changes things for the better. So how should James Gunn approach this? I've seen the reports that you know, they want to make it hopier, kind of like the Christopher Reeves version, and I think that's great. I think need to have you still need to have a solid villain, even if the villain is cynicism. I mean, that's really
Mhm.
the villain we were fighting in the White House most of the time. It wasn't just Republicans; it was cynicism.
Right.
And so you still need a pretty powerful villain there. But I think, you know, the bigger thing with the kind of DC film universe is I think the movies are mostly better than the Marvel movies, and yet you don't want to rewatch them over and over and over.
Yeah.
You know, you kind of have to endure them sometimes.
Right. They're
And I say this as a
punishing.
fan. They're
Yeah.
punishing. Whereas, you know, every night when you turn on the television, there is at least one Marvel movie on cable.
Somewhere.
Every night, sometimes multiple. And I want to have that on as background noise. You know, I
Yeah.
want to see that again. Why not? How many times have I had you know, Avengers Endgame just on cable TV at night? But I'm not going to do that for Justice League. You know,
Right.
I'm not going to do that for Man of Steel, as beautiful as that movie was. So their challenge is, you know, it's still a business. You gotta want people to want to watch these movies.
You know, when Henry Cavill came back and he said, I want to bring back Superman to be more hopeful. I mean, I was excited because I think one of the things about Henry is that he seems like he could be a great Superman. Like if you see him in interviews and then, you know, when he's on Instagram, like he's kind of dorky, like he's very Clark
Yeah,
Kenty in that way.
yeah.
And he's very like sincere, but then his Superman is very like stone faced and you know, and like I want to see him kind of embrace the more hopey Superman, but at the same time, like the reports you're mentioning, like James Gunn is also talking about, you know, just starting over. And I you know, I'm cool with that, I guess, even though I want to see Henry get an opportunity to play like that more hopeful, you know, big blue Boy Scout. But in the event that that doesn't happen, and we do have a whole new DC universe to start from scratch, like I think last time you and I talked, which was like 5 years ago, and this was like before the Justice League came out, even, and then you know the whole DCU kind of falling apart. But at the time, you said you actually prefer the more standalone type movies, and you know we've had like the Matt Reeves Batman and the Todd Phillips Joker, like are not interconnected. And you mentioned like Marvel is kind of like everything is connected. What would you rather like just have like directors come in and just give me your take on these characters, or do you feel like, you know, the market is demanding that there needs to be some connection between all of these different, you know, continuities and narratives?
I mean, what's the point of having an interconnected universe if it's kind of sputtering out all the time? You know, one thing I was surprised by in that piece was I didn't know that Black Adam hadn't done well.
Right.
You know, and so it's hard to have. I'm surprised that they're doing a Blue Beetle, which I
Yeah.
don't think most people have ever even heard of. And then they torpedo Batgirl, and it's like you get the
Yeah.
sense that all of these decisions are just made purely about money. And well, and of course they are, but you don't want that to be the public narrative around your films, right? Like the
Right. When
public
it's like a
narrative
tax
around
break is the reason I canceled this movie. You know, even if that's true, you don't tell people that. Like that's just so talking about cynicism, right?
anybody trying to deny me Michael Keaton's Batman is my enemy.
Yeah.
You know, that really bummed me out. I don't know. I mean, part of it is I think I'd lean towards like an interconnected universe would be more fun, right? You get to see all your favorite characters all the time. Everybody loves a good crossover, you know.
Mhm.
But I do think it'd be more fun to have different directors' takes on these things. You know, I think the single best argument for my personal favorite argument for blowing up the DC universe is getting Jason Momoa to play Lobo. I would be
which he should have been
that.
10 years ago, right? Like,
God, that'd be so great. So great to talk about something you're born to play. I mean, I don't think most people know Lobo either. I don't care. I will be there opening night, dragging friends to it. That'd be awesome. I mean, a good Lobo Superman movie would be fantastic.
Yeah,
just fantastic. And there was a good Lobo Superman series last year. I think it was like a 3-shot. And even Superman was trying to appeal to like Lobo's better nature, which he doesn't have one, you know. But even that interplay and dialogue between them was really fun and fascinating.
So, last question about the DC universe. You came to Superman being your favorite character back in the 90s, right? Like Death of Superman was your
it worked
intro into and talk about like kind of like cynical, you know, plays for you know, getting attention. Let's kill Superman was like the biggest thing of all time in comics. But that hooked you, and you've been a diehard Wednesday Warrior ever since. What is other than Death of Superman, what is your favorite, or maybe like 2 or 3 favorite Superman stories? So comics, it could be animated, it could be movie. Like if you had to like drill down like the top 3 Superman stories you've ever encountered or experienced, what would they be?
Oh man, that's such a good question. There was just a really fun run in like 99 2000 when I think it was Jeff Loeb and Ed McGuinness. Because Ed McGuinness kind of drew him a little cartoonish with like but it worked, and it was a way where it was just fun for a year. It was fun, you know, like the B-13 virus transformed Metropolis, and it was you wanted to read the comics. The flip side of that was what was the storyline called? It was a year-long storyline. Jim Lee did the art, who is, you know, by far my favorite artist. So I hate to criticize.
Was that Unchained
anything.
or Unbound or something like that?
No, way before that. It was the one where like was it The Vanishing or it was the one where like, you know, half the world disappeared and Superman got all dark and introspective, and there was a priest that he would go do confession to.
Oh yeah.
I can't remember what it was called. I mean, the art is incredible.
For Tomorrow?
Yes, For Tomorrow. Good memory.
Yeah.
But you know, the mopey Superman never works for me.
Yeah, right.
Brooding and too introspective, and like, you know, there was some story down I totally passed on where like he lost his powers for a year and decided to walk across America. And it's like, okay, come on. But other great ones. I actually really liked the Warworld saga that just wrapped up, because it was fresh and interesting and totally different, and then like seeded the actual DC stage to his son for a year, which was pretty cool.
One of the, and kind of related to what we were talking about earlier, one of the knocks against Superman is that people who try to like make him edgy or try to make him dark and gritty, they say that like Superman stories are boring. You know, he's too powerful. He's like, you know, he's got no weaknesses. Like you can only use kryptonite so much before it gets tired. And, you know, like I think that Superman is one of the most interesting characters because like his weakness isn't kryptonite, right? His weakness is he loves humanity so much, right? Like his humanity is his strength and his weakness. And stories that get that are the ones that I love. And, you know, my favorite Superman story of all time is Kurt Busiek's story called A Secret Identity, which is kind of like this meta, like this kid in the real world named Clark Kent. And, you know, as a joke, his parents always buy him Superman like swag all the time. And then one day he wakes up with Superman's powers. And he meets a girl named Lois, and it kind of morphs into a traditional Superman story. And I always thought like, that's the movie I want. I want like Charlie Kaufman and Spike Jonze to do like a real meta Secret Identity adaptation, because I think that, you know, that to me is like the ideal Superman story.
I've always kind of dreamt of writing a Superman screenplay. I mean, you know, maybe now's my moment. But
hey, DC, if you're listening.
One thing I'd love to partially base it off of actually is my favorite non-canonical miniseries is American Alien. It's fantastic, and it's different artists for each book, but it's basically, you know, young Clark finding his way in the world. They don't do it in kind of the same way that's been done a whole bunch of times. Like he moves Metropolis as a kid basically, and he's trying to, you know, sort out jobs and love, and it's one of the rare times you see him have a girlfriend, you know, who just happens to be kind of this down on her luck.
I'm not that familiar with that storyline actually.
It's so good, and like, you know, Bruce Wayne and Batman are kind of involved, but there's just this amazing scene in I think book 4 between Clark, who's just a cub reporter at this point, and Lex Luthor, who just treats him with complete and total disdain. but they have this amazing monologue between the two of them about Lex's kind of vision, which is that humanity can perfect itself and doesn't need help from an alien.
Yeah.
It's fabulous.
And that goes back to like what you were saying earlier about, Superman's greatest enemy is cynicism. And that's why I think Lex Luthor works. That's the other complaint, is that like every Superman movie, the villain is Lex Luthor, and we want to see him punching somebody. But like to again, back to the parallel to the president, he talks about a battle of wills. And that's ultimately what the Superman Luthor rivalry is. It's not about punching each other. It's this battle of wills and hope versus cynicism. Because at the end of the day, like, Lex embodies, he may believe in the perfection of humanity, but he's really talking about himself.
Lex's best, right? Because he's the perfect man in his view,
right?
He even in that I think it's a different book where he actually makes Clark Kent feel his muscles. He's like, see, these are real. I had to work for these. They don't come from the sun. What was I just going to say? Oh yeah, well that's when Lex's schemes are actually the best. It's not when he makes some kryptonite robot. It's when he turns people against Superman. Yeah, through lies. And then only then does Superman sort of doubt himself. Not necessarily in a mopey way, but that's more damaging than kryptonite.
I mean, I've long argued that, I liked Man of Steel enough. I didn't like the third act of that movie. But my main issue with Batman v Superman was that I felt the problem with that movie is that Ben Affleck should have shaved his head and just played Lex Luthor, because Bruce Wayne in that movie is ultimately Lex Luthor. He's this rich tech billionaire who, creates a kryptonite weapon to kill Superman. Like that's his whole storyline. Like you should have just made him Luthor, because that's the perfect Lex Luthor. And then had like Batman be his friend.
My dream Lex is, do you watch Billions?
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen Corey Stoll in Billions?
Yeah.
That's my.
He said he was so wasted as the villain in Ant-Man that he would have been a great Lex.
My dream scene that nobody's made yet, but it's been in comics over and over and over, is where Lex is on the top of his L-shaped building, looking out these plate glass windows over his city, and Superman just kind of flies up with his arms folded and stares at him with his eyes glowing. The one person who can challenge him. No one has put that in a movie yet, and it drives me nuts.
Cody, I could talk DC with you for hours and hours, but I know that we don't have that kind of time. In the meantime, how can folks find Grace, and where can they find you online?
CodyKeenan.com. It's the first time I've ever had my own website, where most of the big tour events just wrapped up as of yesterday, but I keep adding things all the time, whether they're digital or in person. I'm still traveling every once in a while. I'm going to try to take December off to hang out with my daughter, but I'm Cody Keenan on Twitter, Instagram, online. As a writer, I usually hate almost everything I write, but I'm intensely proud of this book. And the reaction to it has made me very, very happy, especially when I'll get, one of my email addresses is public, my academic one. So I'll wake up every morning to one or two or more emails from strangers, which is wonderful to see. But the best ones were just before the midterms. A couple of people actually said it inspired them to go out and canvas for their candidate, and that's something I hadn't imagined. And talk about something that'll make you hopeful.
Right. Well, there you go. Like we said it earlier, Grace is the reason the Democrats held on to the Senate in 2022. So everyone thank Cody Keenan. Cody, thank you so much for coming back and chatting with us about all things Obama and Superman.
Anytime, dude.
Do it again.
If I ever do write this screenplay, you'll be the first place I come.
That's awesome. I'll hold you to that.
All right.
I appreciate it.
Good to see you, Keith.
Maybe a nerd who's just like you, talking about the things that you like too. So I invite you to the NOC. In full color, you see me. The hard knock life. Comics, movies, and TV. Yeah. Pop culture with a different perspective. Watch it on your screen, hit play, so check this.